We are checking now page 341 questions, page 341, and we'll talk about the items related to those questions as we go, hopefully. The first question, what requirements did the Military Reconstruction Act set down for the states in order for them to be reconstructed and restored to full status? Okay, there are two of them. What's the first one, Jessica?
I have more to, but
Louder, please.
imposed military occupation on the South with Union generals divided into 5 military districts.
That was not something that was required in order for them to be reconstructed. That's something they simply did to the South. There were two requirements to be reconstructed. What's the first one, Sarah?
Each state had to write a new constitution to provide a universal male suffrage regardless of color.
Exactly, that's one. Writing a new constitution that would have universal manhood suffrage regardless of color. Okay, what's the second requirement? Sally.
They had to also pass the 14th Amendment, and
Right.
later legislation said they had to pass the 15th Amendment as well.
Right, all you needed was that they had to pass the 14th Amendment. And what is the 14th Amendment? That we talked about yesterday. No one remembers what the 14th Amendment was? Sally?
It was the guarantee of citizens' rights regardless of color.
Say that again louder.
It was like the guarantee of citizens' rights.
Regardless of,
Color.
right. So the 14th Amendment said that all are citizens regardless of their color. Citizens of the United States, which also applied to the states, which remember is a part of that. So the southern states had to agree to the 14th Amendment or pass the 14th Amendment in order to get back into the United States. Now, that becomes problematic in that the states that were a part of the United States didn't have to pass the 14th Amendment in order to stay in the United States. Because in order to become an amendment, not all the states had to pass it. So conceivably, you could have states in the United States that had not passed the 14th Amendment, but in order to be a state, you had to pass it. So that seemed a little bit unequitable. Even passing the 14th Amendment had some controversy. I believe it was New Jersey. There was some question as to whether the ratification by New Jersey was even legal. There seemed to be some manipulation of things there. So if you read some of the history outside of the textbooks into some of what was happening there, you'll find that there are some questions about constitutionality of some things, and certainly this would be one of them, that you had to pass an amendment in order to be in the United States. All right, but that is the answer to number one, those two factors. Any question? 2 points, one for each of those. Number two, let me see if there's anything else I want to say about that. I think that's all. You did Jessica did bring up the military ruling over the South by the North, and that involved dividing the South into 5 military districts with a general over each of them, just as if it was occupied territory, just like we did in Germany after World War II, over Japan. Just like any war, the conquerors have a military presence there, and the same was true of this. And remember, that goes contrary to how Lincoln perceived the nation ought to head following the war. All right, number two then, what is the difference between a carpetbagger and a scalawag? What's a carpetbagger, Hayden?
Carpetbaggers are northern radicals and scalawags are southern radicals.
Well, all northern radicals are not called carpetbaggers, so your answer is incorrect. Lydia?
That they were northern radicals that moved to the South.
Northern radicals who moved to the South in order to have a role in the governing, to have some authority down there. Because remember, most of the Southerners who had voted before were still not able to vote, and so they needed people to come down and hold office. And So many radical Republicans came south to do that. So why were they called carpetbaggers? Jill?
Their luggage was made of cheap carpet and clean.
Yeah, I don't know if you can you picture this? You take some carpet and you fold it up and attach a handle to it, sew up the sides, and you've got a suitcase. That's pretty much what they did. That's a cheap way to make a suitcase. And there were so many of them coming down from the north who were not wealthy people. They were people who didn't have much themselves, but they saw an opportunity to earn a living and maybe even gain some wealth by going to the south and taking positions down there. So they're called carpetbaggers. All right, the second part of the question is, what is a scalawag? What is a scalawag? What do you have, Haley?
That they were Southern radicals.
They were what?
Southern radicals.
Okay, we'll take that. These are native Southerners who go along with the radicals, participated with the radicals in ruling over the South. So, you've got a group of Southern people, and one of them decides to cooperate with the radical Republican rule, the military rule, and so they become, if you will, a collaborator, someone who sees an opportunity also to get involved in government, to get involved in such a way as to maybe make some money out of it, and so other Southerners call them a scalawag. All right, any questions then about the difference between the two, carpetbagger and a scalawag? 2 points for number 2. All right, number 3. The most notorious extremist vigilante group in the South during Reconstruction was whom? Sophia.
The Ku Klux Klan.
Right, the Ku Klux Klan, known by their initials KKK. Now, again, here's something, if you read outside the textbooks and some of the other literature, you find out that sometimes things in the textbooks may be an oversimplification. And I'm not saying that this is exactly the truth, but according to one book I've read, at least part of the original purpose of in the forming of the Ku Klux Klan was not to suppress blacks from voting, but to protect them from the radical Republican groups that were forcing them to vote Republican. And they've got some facts to back that up, but it certainly would take more research to find out just where the truth lies. And that the vehemently anti-black reputation of the Ku Klux Klan came about because of the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20th century. That the Ku Klux Klan died out in the 19th century, and then in the early 20th century, there was a resurgence. And that brand of the Ku Klux Klan was extremely racist. But according to at least one source I've read, the original group was not that way at all. It's difficult to say, and there may be some truth on both sides of that. By the way, in the early 20th century, the Ku Klux Klan had quite a presence in Youngstown. I remember my son did a report on this in high school or college about the Ku Klux Klan in Youngstown. We don't usually think of that as being something that's associated with Youngstown, were they competing with the mob, the mafia, I don't know, or were they working together? But apparently there was quite a lot of activity in this area of the Ku Klux Klan. And certainly racism hasn't gone away in this area. And in recent years, we have certainly seen evidence of that. Okay, so that's some of the Ku Klux Klan. Number 4. What system of farming was the South's main economic response to the devastation caused by the Civil War? What do you have there, Nate?
Sharecropping.
Right, and can you explain sharecropping?
Some answer, but it was like people would rent out their property to other people to work it, and make money off of it.
Right, because no longer are there slaves available to work land. So if you wanted your land to be productive, you needed to hire people. Well, there wasn't much cash around, so it was difficult to pay people to work. And so the system that they came up with was to allow people to live on the land and divide it all up, and people living, different families living on different parts of the land. And as they are farming it, as they're working it, then they give a portion of what they grow to the landowner. It's similar in some ways to feudalism. Now, sometimes the sharecropper would actually own the land or be paying for the land. In some cases, simply renting the land. But sharecropping became very prominent throughout the South after the Civil War, up until probably, well, in some ways, till the mid-20th century. And some after that it had died out somewhat before that in many places. But that's, and people didn't make much progress. If you're a sharecropper, you were dependent on, of course, your crops like any farmer, but you never were able to produce enough to get ahead. You're always trying to pay off the rent or the loan for the land. And so it was very difficult. If you're a sharecropper, you were generally poor. Didn't really make much headway. All right, let's look back through the chapter, see if there's anything else that we. You didn't have any questions about the Freedmen's Bureau. Let's make sure we touch upon that. Back on 337, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by the federal government in order to give help to the newly freed slaves. You know, if emancipation had occurred slowly over time and had been done like it had been done in the northern states, when slaves were emancipated, the government helped to bring that slave into society, into the economy. The slave owners were paid for the loss of their labor. It was a smoother transition. But following the Civil War, the emancipation that takes place is sudden and drastic. You know, suddenly you have thousands and thousands of slaves who no longer have a job, per se. They have nothing to do. And so there were some of them that gathered together in bands and just roamed around the countryside, stealing whatever they could to live. And many of them became sharecroppers. Some of them stayed on the plantations where they had been slaves and continued to work, only now the plantation owner is paying them if there's money available. But there were a lot of people that were kind of left loose. They had nothing, no education, of course. They had maybe no skills. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was established to help them, and especially to protect their rights. You know, because if they were taken into court for any reason, oftentimes if Southerners were in charge of it, they might just rule against them simply because they were former slaves. There was certainly a lot of bitterness toward the fact that slavery had been ended so quickly, and in the minds of those who owned slaves, cruelly, because they lost so much of their property. And there were times when the Bureau did overrule what a court may have said, because the Bureau was looking out for the interests of the slaves. The Black Codes is something with which you need to be familiar. Those were laws passed by President Johnson's, the states that had become reconstructed under President Johnson immediately after the war. And those were laws designated toward regulating the behavior of blacks, where they could go, what they could do, and many times seemed to be done in an unfair manner. One of the things that were done was it was, you know, many black former slaves had nothing to do, and so they were hanging around. They got no home, and so they were arrested for being vagrants. And so And that was easy to do because there were so many people that didn't have a place to live. Well, then, being convicted as a vagrant, they would be hired out then from jail to work, and so they almost became slaves again. Codes likewise prohibited blacks from voting, from holding office, or serving on juries. Now, one of the things that seems to be somewhat hypocritical is that those kind of offenses against black people in the South that were supposed to be corrected by the Freedmen's Bureau, they were looking out for that, but they didn't seem to care about those very same things happening in the North. There were many northern towns that had signs at the edge of town saying this is a sundown town. In other words, and the explanation was, if you are black, you are to be out of town by sundown. You're not allowed to be here after sundown. Yeah, and there were a number of states that enacted laws to keep these freed slaves from coming into their states. So at the same time, the South is being criticized for their attitude, but many northern areas had the same kinds of attitudes, where black people couldn't vote, they didn't seem to have any rights, and so on. All right, any questions or comments about the Freedmen's Bureau or the Black Codes? The head of the Freedmen's Bureau was a Christian general, Oliver O. Howard. His career is sketched back on 312 to 313 if you're interested in reading about him. Howard University is named after him. Okay, we talked about carpetbaggers, scalawags, Ku Klux Klan, sharecropping. Oh, and then there's a group of people called Redeemers. They were men who were fighting for white majority rule to take back power from the radical Republicans. So you ought to be familiar with that term. And that takes us pretty much to the place where it's time to elect a new president. And war hero Ulysses S. Grant comes on the stage as a politician. All right, so we have 6 points on this page. We're going to combine that with the next page, which is your assignment for tomorrow, and that is to complete, first of all, you keep doing your outline, pages 341 to 348, Reconstruction in the North, and a Reconstructed Nation, very short section at the end. Complete the section review on page 348. We'll add those questions to what we did for today. Any questions that you have? All right, so hang on to the paper you now have in your hands or in your notebook. You're going to add on the same paper, if you like, the questions on page 348. And you can start on that. Get some of that done before the period.